That was close.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our monthly webinar. We are super excited for this topic. Can hearing loss and sugar impact your risk for dementia? My name is Paige Fairbanks-Gunn. I am the Regional Sales Director, Manager for Kelch Senior Communities in the Arizona region, and I've been helping families with difficult caregiving decisions and placement decisions for over 25 years. And Pam is my partner here, and she's the founder of Alzheimer's Family Consulting, national speaker and dementia author for It's Not That Simple, helping families navigate the dementia journey. She works one-on-one with families to help them regain their peace of mind and quality of life while caregiving for a person with dementia. So we are super excited for this, and I'll hand it over to you, Pam. And
thank you. Well, thank you. And yes, I'm Pam Ostrowski. I'm the founder of Alzheimer's Family Consulting. And Paige and I do this once a month to bring in experts or to talk about whether it's communications with a loved one or a person with dementia or any other aspects of the dementia journey, because people have questions, right? You guys are, wondering what types of things are happening and how to deal with that journey. So what I'd like to do, if possible, is to go through and introduce our prestigious and guests. And we, as you guys know, based on all the emails I've sent you, we have Angel Hoffman from the Alzheimer's Association. Angel, do you want to talk just a brief where you serve the Alzheimer's Association?
Yeah, so I'm in the Colorado chapter. I serve North and West Colorado, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement.
Excellent, thank you. And then Dr. Harmon, one of our audiologists.
Yes, I am Dr. Bailey Harmon. I am a cochlear implant audiologist, so I mostly work with individuals who have encountered some sort of moderate to profound hearing loss. And I currently do research for a cochlear implant company working to advance different technologies.
Excellent. We're going to need that. My dad had 90% hearing loss because he was in artillery in World War II. And it's a really challenging journey for sure. So thank you. And thank you goes out to Dr. Amoro as well. How's the audio working? Yep. Have to there you go.
There we go.
There we go.
I couldn't figure out where the unmute button was since I had to call in, but I figured it out. So my name is Dr. Carly Amoro. I am a clinical audiologist and director of audiology for Peak ENT and Voice Center in Colorado. And so as far as cognitive health and hearing, I do that every single day with every single patient. It's very much relevant.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And thank all three of you for coming today to share your wisdom. And thank you, Paige, for sponsoring this important topic. I sit on both sides of this. I have tinnitus and I have diabetes. So I'm really interested in what everybody, this is really about me. So let's kick off, Angel, with you. And, you were just at a conference and I'd like to hear, what the name of it was and what you were focused on. And then, what did you hear from that conference about, or that collaborative about hearing, about sugar in particular and its effect on our brain health?
Yeah, so just to back up a little bit, the Alzheimer's Association, we have something what's called the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, and it's held every year, and it brings researchers from around the globe. And we are the largest nonprofit funder of research for Alzheimer's and other dementias around the globe. Third only to the US government and the Chinese government. But at the conference this past year, and what's been more and more evident is that our lifestyle can there are a lot of lifestyle factors that can help decrease our risk for developing dementia in the first place. And in fact, at this last conference, the Lancet Commission came out and said almost 50% of all dementias, we can have a risk reduction just by our lifestyle changes. And so one of those happens to be diabetes. And I was at a conference. So at the Alzheimer's Association, we're also really now focused on public health and looking at Alzheimer's disease as a public health issue for the vast numbers and the impact that it has on the economy, that it has on healthcare, that it has on our loved ones and the people living with dementia, right? And so we're really looking at that public health focus, and from that public health lens, bringing together public health departments and Alzheimer's Association staff, and how do we go out into the community and make sure that we're talking about, people often think about, for example, smoking is a public health issue, and we know that there has been risk or a reduction over the years since the health department and the American Cancer Society, focusing on these issues. And we think about from smoking that it affects our lungs and it affects our risk for cancer, but people don't really think about it impacting their brain health, and it does. And diabetes is one of those things that impacts our brain health. And so when we're talking about diabetes in particular, and this collaborative again that I went to in Arizona last week or the week before, no, it was last week, really talking about the impact that those blood sugars can have on our cognitive health. Why that is, that's still kind of up for debate. And not debate, the research is still ongoing. Turns out that Alzheimer's disease, as well as diabetes, is a pretty complicated disease. But what they're looking at is really the way that that insulin resistance affects our brain health. So we know that glucose, that sugar or insulin is a major food for the brain. And diabetes disrupts that metabolism of glucose in the brain, so the brain receives less energy than it needs or requires. We also know with diabetes that it's also associated with a lot of other comorbidities that are associated with dementia, such as hypertension, obesity, cholesterol, high cholesterol, and all of that disrupts the vascular process in the body, which affects our brain. So we know that that good vascular blood flow is really important for our brain health. Every time our heart beats, 25% of that blood flow goes to our brain. So that good vascular health is actually impacted by diabetes as part of its process. And so it also then impacts our brain health as well. So when we think about the other thing that's really kind of interesting is that similarly to diabetes, research has also shown that glucose is not used properly in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. This may be because there is cell death from Alzheimer's disease, which reduces the brain's ability to interpret messages. And those beta amyloid plaques, which are one of the hallmark proteins for Alzheimer's disease, can build up in the brain, is also shown to prevent insulin receptors in the brain from doing their job correctly. So this can have an impact of insulin productivity and cause brain cells to become insensitive to insulin. So that's also kind of another fascinating caveat about just diabetes in particular and Alzheimer's disease. So we know that your risk of developing type 2 diabetes increases that, if you're overweight or obese, that if you're age 35 years of age or older, if you have a family history of diabetes, if you're a person of color, if you're not physically active, or if you've had prediabetes. Now, my sister, several years ago, went to the doctor and he wasn't super sensitive when he told her she had diabetes. And he said, well, you fit the criteria because you're fat, female, and over 40, is what he said to her. So there are some risk for developing.
Ouch.
Yes, right? I couldn't believe that he actually said that.
Yeah, so much for bedside manner, right?
Right. So the things that we want to focus on for management for, also I'll back up and say some studies have shown that once we have diabetes, the potential for it impacting our brain health is likely already starting to happen. And so it's much easier to decrease our risk in the first place than trying to backtrack when we already have diabetes. But if we are experiencing diabetes or some ways to manage that for our overall brain health, we know that many Americans in general, we consume way too much sugar. And it said, I read a study that said on average, Americans consume about 17 teaspoons of sugar every day, which is 2 to 3 times more the recommended daily allowance for men and women. So this adds up, and this is astounding to me. 60 pounds of added sugar consumed annually. And that's you think about that as 6 10-pound bowling balls. That's a lot of sugar. That's a lot of
That's
sugar.
a ton of sugar. I mean, and Paige is going to ask this question, so I'll just leave it alone, but that is amazing.
It's really bad.
I want everybody to start paying attention to, tomorrow, start reading your labels.
Yes.
That's one of the things we're going to talk about. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
think about men should have no more than 9 teaspoons of sugar or 36 grams, equaling 150 calories of sugar per day. And to me, that still seems like a lot, but there's so many hidden sugars is the thing. And then women should consume no more than 6 teaspoons or 25 grams, which equal 100 calories per day. We also, when we think about diabetes, to think about what we call the ABCs of diabetes. So A, check your A1C, which gives a good time frame of over 2 to 3 months of what your blood sugar is. Check your blood pressure and your cholesterol, because these are also diseases that can be associated with diabetes. So when we think about some ways to cut down on that sugar or to minimize it, the number one thing, sugary drinks, sodas, pops. I have a friend who used to drink the big gulp from 7-Eleven Mountain Dew, and not just one, but like 2 a day. That's loaded with sugar. So cutting down on even sports drinks and energy drinks and sweetened tea. I'm from Missouri, and our family, grew up drinking sweet tea.
And Angel, that brings me to a question, because you're rolling into it. This is my favorite, because this is what everyone wants to know, is what kind of foods and beverages should we be avoiding?
Right. So I'm headed right down that list. So we also want to think about, what's high on the glycemic index, white rice, and having those more dense carbohydrate type of foods. When we think about cutting back on sugary drinks, well, what can we have instead? We can try herbal teas, sparkling water, black tea, green tea, coffee, water that's infused with cucumber or mint. There are a lot of other things that we can do besides having those sugary drinks. We think about sugary desserts, right? That's a no-brainer. We know that. But what can we try instead? Or fresh fruits, yogurt with cinnamon or nutmeg, using spices a lot more than maybe you normally do. Think about eating fruit that might be baked, poached, or stewed. So eating fruit in a different way. Dark chocolate that's at least 70% cocoa or higher, so it has that less sugar. Also, talked about this, avoiding sauces. We know spaghetti sauce can be really high in sugar. Ketchup can be really high in sugar. There are now products out there that say no sugar added, so look for those. Also, eating full fat food, which sounds maybe counterintuitive. Doesn't mean that we have to load everything up with butter, but oftentimes, and I know my mom is like this, she looks for the no fat food thinking that it's healthier for her.
Right.
Sometimes what happens is that's loaded with more sugar just to make it palatable to people, or loaded with.
Exactly. Although I will tell you that the Del Monte has a no sugar added, just stevia extract their peaches and their mandarin oranges and those types of fruits. And so I always look for those. But it is the other thing too, I think, is it's added sugar. So what you're looking for on the label is added sugar, because if you Google on one of your apps or on a Google search for apples, all right, apples, you will see they have X number of grams of sugar. That's naturally occurring sugar. That's different than added sugar, but you still have to pay attention to your consumption, right?
Well, and corn
apples
syrup
also
too.
have fiber, which also
Yeah.
is important. So
Yeah. Well, my physician actually asked me, she's like, how much bread do you eat a day lately? And I said, oh, well, I'm really busy. So I have two slices of toast in the morning or a bagel in the morning. I fix myself a sandwich at lunchtime, and then I might have a roll in the evening. She's like, oh no, you're cutting all that bread out of your diet, because we don't think about it, but something like you mentioned, the simple carbohydrate converts to sugar, and then that has the same effect as if you just ate a candy bar. In a lot of ways, it's slower, right? But it still affects your brain health.
right. And bread is surprisingly high in sodium a lot of times as well. Something to pay attention to. So also when you're thinking about full fat, that like low fat vanilla yogurt has more sugar in it than full plain yogurt. So, thinking about that, it's really being a smart consumer. And like you said, reading labels. Also eating whole foods, and not the grocery store, but eating whole foods and not ultra processed foods. That's one of the things that also, not surprising to anyone, but came out at our research conference this past summer. Ultra processed foods are terrible for our brain health. It also promotes inflammation in our body. So making sure that we're eating those whole foods. And you can think about ultra processed foods. I mean, we live busy lives, right? And people have busy schedules. It's really easy to just grab something that's already made. But if you're looking at the label and you see the sodium content is probably high in an ultra processed food, there's a lot of sugar in it. And if you're reading the label and it's a mile long and you can't buy, 2/3 of those ingredients in your store, then it's a ultra processed food. So
I like that you can't buy the ingredient in your store. That's a good tip, because you don't really think about it. You think about, well, I can't pronounce it. It's like, well, can you buy it in your store? That's great. I love that.
And almost 90% of added sugars in American diets come from ultra processed food. So paying attention to that. And then also checking the sugar quantity in canned foods. Like I mentioned, spaghetti sauce, fruit that's in heavy syrup. Those are things to avoid, obviously. Also thinking about what we consider as healthy processed snack foods like granola bars. A store-bought granola bar can be oftentimes have a really high content of sugar. So paying attention to that. The same with sugary breakfast cereals. And sometimes we think of granola as the healthy choice, and oftentimes it has more sugar in it than a lot of other cereals. And then being, a smart consumer about looking for those hidden sugars like high fructose corn syrup, cane sugar, cane juice, maltose, rice syrup, molasses, caramel, all of those things we need to pay attention to when we're looking at labels. And then also thinking about eating more protein. And this is really from thinking about that being satiated and feeling full and not wanting to overeat, that when we eat more protein, it's also been shown to reduce our food cravings. So paying attention, maybe upping your protein intake might help that craving that you might feel. And then we know that also artificial sweeteners, so those saccharin type things we want to stay away from, that they can change our gut microbiome and lead to poor blood sugar control. So thinking about, you mentioned stevia is much better choice. And then also simply keeping those things that tempt us out of sight and maybe not have it at our house, or have it at our house occasionally. You know, I'm more likely to grab a Hershey Kisses if it's sitting on a counter in a bowl than if it's hidden somewhere, or if it's in my cabinet and I don't see it. So, you know, don't have those things around that tempt us a lot.
Well, my neighbor actually said, she's like, don't you put your chocolate like in the freezer, and then, you know, when it's cold, and two, you have to get up out of your chair and go to the refrigerator. And I said, it's 10 feet away. Why would I care? I said, when I want chocolate, I want chocolate. So I am one of those people who has to have it out of the house. I cannot have it in the house. I apparently have no willpower. You know, a little personal note about me.
Me too. I can't have it in the house. Otherwise, I'll go straight for it.
And then,
So.
you know, the other things that we know is getting enough sleep. That poor sleep's been linked to depression and, you know, poor concentration. It reduces our immune function and increase our risk for obesity. But it also affects the types of foods that we tend to crave and want to have. And so when we're sleep deprived, we tend to gravitate towards those foods that are higher in sugar and fat and salt and calories. And so, you know, food is one of those tricky things because it's so much more than just, again, sustenance for our body. It has a cultural meaning to us. It has a comfort meaning to us. And we rarely think about food as medicine, but it really is. It's a predictor of our health. And so I think the less that oftentimes, when we start to pull away from those things that are super sugary or super salty, when we do go back to them, they seem like ultra sugary or ultra salty because our taste buds get used to wanting things. And so, and we can, by, you know, some of these different opportunities of changing the way we look at food can be helpful and hopefully help decrease our wanting a lot of sugar, paying attention to how much sugar we're getting, and then ultimately impacting our brain health.
It's
So
definitely changing your behavior.
Yes.
And nobody said it was easy, right?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's we were hoping that's what you'd be coming to the table with there, Angel, is let me tell you the easy.
Yeah.
Let me tell you the three things that will make this so much easier on you.
The cure. Yeah. I will tell you, there's a really cool app for those of you, maybe you have it, but I've been using it for the last year, and it's called Yuka. And you scan it and it will literally tell you, so you don't have to read every label and you got to grab your glasses. It'll just tell you it's good, bad, and what hazards and how many grams of sugar in it.
How do you spell that? Or could you put it in the chat so people
Yep.
can look it up, please?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll put it in the chat.
I have never heard of that. You'd think
Oh,
I
I
would
love
know that
it.
one.
My son got me on it because he's terrified of getting diabetes because his father's side are high diabetics. So, and he's been borderline a couple of times, and he's only 27. So
Yeah. And it's interesting, and Angel, you know, can you share a bit more about, like, we think right in the moment, like, I'm going to have a piece of chocolate cake now, but what's the number of years that between behavior and the connection where Alzheimer's symptoms show up?
Yeah, so people we think the disease is actually developing about a decade or more before symptoms ever present. And so, you know, we're really talking about, you know, lifestyle changes that hopefully people will have their entire life. Now, doesn't mean that if I'm 65 years old and I've done none of these things, that these things aren't still good for me. They are, and important to do for our overall quality of life and health. But you know, getting that message out to our kids and grandkids and really being a smart consumer and really making those lifestyle choices that will impact our overall health and our brain health.
Absolutely. So we don't have any questions right now. I suspect everybody's feverishly taking notes and trying to figure out what they're going to have for dinner tonight. I know I am. Let's see,
Lots of
no
good
tomato sauce, no
Clean
tomato
food.
sauce. Yeah, a clean food, exactly.
Clean
Fruits
food,
and
yeah.
vegetables with a little bit of protein. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I don't know about you guys, but I know that do you ever hear those people, or are you one of those people who says, oh, I can't possibly eat all of that cake. It's just too sweet. Well, it's like, I have never met a piece of cake or a dessert that I said, oh my gosh, it's too sweet.
Right? Yeah, me either.
And my doctor said, yes, and that's shown up on the scale. So knock it off.
Right. Yeah.
But thank you for sharing the amount of time, because one of the things that we hear a lot about, and I'm preaching to the choir, I know, that there is always people saying, oh, well, there's no cure for Alzheimer's. And it's like, no, but there is prevention. And the same is true, like the American Heart Association's been talking since the 60s about eating healthy and eating clean and reducing stress and getting more sleep and getting exercise. And they haven't had much luck either, but at least they have a medication. There's no medication. So what you're talking about is more important than any other conversation, in my opinion, because this is about prevention, right?
Right.
Okay. So did you have anything else you'd like to share?
Not at this time, but thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Well, you will have an
Mhm.
opportunity to weigh in on the hearing loss conversation as well. So don't go
Yes.
anywhere. So we're going to transition now over to talking with our two audiologists about the other side of this webinar, which is, can hearing loss impact your dementia risk? So, Dr. Amaro, do you want to start? And then what I figured is that you and Dr. Harmon can play off of each other. So if you have something to say, then you can ask Dr. Harmon or vice versa, depending on who answers first. Got it? Okay. So first you're going to have to unmute.
Okay.
All right.
So I'm calling in from my phone. I just want to check, how's the volume right now? Is this pretty good?
Yep.
If I'm yelling, just tell me to tone it down.
Can always be, no, if anything, start shouting from the rooftops.
I have some coworkers here still seeing patients, so they might not like that, but I think this is a great transition because a lot of people don't know this, but if you have diabetes, you actually have a higher risk of sensory neural hearing loss. And so what that means is you're more likely to develop hearing loss beyond what is normal with the natural aging process anyways. So
why is that? Do we know?
I think it, off the top of my head, I can't say for sure, but I think it has to do with like other issues with neuropathy that can come with diabetes.
Got it.
And kind of the neuroplasticity there or whatnot with the inner ear and things like that, where it's more likely to progress. I don't know if Bailey, you have a better answer than me on that one.
It actually has to do a decent amount as well with the fluids that are in the inner ear. The fluid that moves the hair cells in the inner ear, which are what sends the signal up to our brain, is very, very sensitive. And we actually notice a lot of changes as well with hormones, with greater fluctuations with weight or decreases with weight, different medication changes. And so a lot of it has to do with the concentration of that fluid, which is why when you have diabetes, you are more prone to a greater progression of that hearing loss.
Tag teaming is working well today, you guys. So, that's kind of a nice transition because, again, a lot of people don't know that, but those individuals, if I know they have diabetes, that's one of the first things I say, even if they're more of a borderline hearing aid candidate and maybe not pursuing amplification at the time, I make it very clear to them, we need to monitor every year. We need to get you back in, no more than 3 years from now for an updated test because it's probably going to progress and it tends to be more severe in those individuals, especially the patients that I have seen. Now, not always. There's, just like everything else, there's always exceptions to the rule. But typically, that's something that we're always thinking about from our side. But hearing loss, as we've been talking about cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, when you're thinking about all the things that you need in order to function at a high level, hearing is a big piece of it. Because if you're in a noisy situation, just to make it as hard as possible, you're in a noisy situation, you're already really trying to focus in, what's the speech that I want to hear? Even when you have normal hearing, you go to a loud restaurant, they've got really high ceilings. It's a very, what we call, taxing environment as far as your cognitive load on what you're doing and listening to, but also your brain trying to filter out what's important versus not important. In normal hearing, that's really challenging. And so when you add the hearing loss piece to it, then those individuals have less of a resource to rely on to really help themselves hear what they want to hear in that situation. But the other piece of it is, if you're not treating the hearing loss, then you're putting more cognitive load on your prefrontal cortex, your working memory, essentially, where what it should be doing is categorizing what's important for short-term memory versus long-term memory. But instead of doing those tasks, it's trying to I like to say, the ultimate game of Mad Libs. If you don't know what that is, fill in the words. But basically, it's trying to figure out, okay, based off of the context of this statement that I heard and what I think I'm lip reading, what are we talking about? And so even for people who treat their hearing loss, there is an increased amount of what we call listening effort, even in just mild background noise. So when you have untreated hearing loss, it's even more challenging.
Yeah, I tell you, the designs of restaurants these days, like you said, with the high ceiling, it is so hard. And then you're sitting at a table surrounded by other tables. And, sometimes, and I don't know if you'll talk to this or if it's appropriate here, but to me, the sounds around me are louder than the sound in front of me. And it's just, it's really hard. And then you have people who talk really quietly. And so, yeah, it's scary. I will tell you, as someone who's in this situation, it scares me that I can't hear somebody else. So sometimes I'll just nod my head like, sure, I have no idea what you just said because it's too noisy. So yeah, I appreciate that. So, aside from the obvious, like not being a World War II veteran who is impacted by artillery, what are some of the things that we can do to prevent hearing loss and still be able to hear what's going on in the world?
So Bailey, do you want to tackle it first? Or do you want me to tackle it first?
I can go ahead and jump in. I mean, the most obvious one is going to be using hearing protection. Any sort of loud environments, Carly and I are in Colorado as well, so we've got glorious and beautiful red rocks there, and all of these great venues, but we really want to protect what we already have, because we do see, as any other aging process, we see just a natural decline in our ability to hear as we get older. And so we want to protect everything that we have and preserve it as well as possible. Also, Pam, you were mentioning those noisy environments and everything like that. We don't necessarily want to be wearing hearing protection every time we're going into restaurants, but knowing where some of those issues may lie for you. Dr. Morrow and I counsel heavily on where to position yourself in some of those environments to make it easier for you to understand. And we've got—
Where would those be?
So it kind of depends based on if you're wearing a hearing aid or an amplification device. In that case, a lot of those technologies already have noise reduction factors installed in them. And so it already factors in the noise to be behind you. So a lot of people will anticipate that you should be sitting against a wall, so that wall kind of captures the sound, but that's actually not the case. When we're wearing hearing aids or a cochlear implant, you actually want your back to be facing the rest of the restaurant because those devices are already working to reduce that noise. But when you aren't wearing any of those devices, looking for well-lit areas, maybe quieter areas of the restaurants, we always encourage patients as well to call ahead if they really know they're going to struggle. Most people are happy to help you position yourself and your group to be in the ideal scenario. So.
Absolutely. And
Good, thank you.
For just to piggyback on that, when you're outside of the restaurant, so we're coming into holiday season, so I always like to say you're at a holiday party, you're standing around, there's an hors d'oeuvres table, appetizers, maybe to the side, and you want to kind of look around the room and think, okay, where are the most number of people? Maybe there's a band, and so you want to try and put the noise behind you, like Bailey was saying. So, or I tell people, if you're standing in a group and you can kind of so if you're in a semicircle, right, and then the person you're trying to hear is over here and you're standing here, but maybe behind this person is the open room versus this is the wall. You kind of want to walk around and make them turn. So then you're facing the wall and the target signal is not, this little speech with all of this noise. You want to try and separate it as best you can. Of course, that can be challenging. I mean, even a restaurant, Tammy was saying earlier, go in, it's an open seating type of thing. I myself, I don't think I said this earlier, I myself have hearing loss. I've had hearing loss my whole life. I was born with hearing loss. And so for me, whenever I go into a restaurant, I'm kind of checking out where people are in their meal, how far along are they? Is it a group of girls who look like they're on maybe their first cocktail and they're getting a little louder? I'm going to try and put the most noise I can behind me. So it's little things like that too, where if you have to sit in the middle of the restaurant, pay attention to where they are in their meal and things like that. And I say that for everyone, not even just individuals with hearing loss. It's kind of a nice little secret tip to hear better in background noise for sure. But, with preventing hearing loss, there's so many factors that come into play. Obviously, we talked about diabetes, noise exposure, occupational work, but sometimes too it is genetic. So if your mom had hearing loss, your grandmother had hearing loss, your great grandmother had hearing loss, your sister has hearing loss, you're probably going to have some type of hearing loss. And so it's not like I can say, eat a banana every day at this time and you're not going to have hearing loss. I wish it was that simple.
What?
I know, right? And so, part of that is it happens. I tell my patients every day, a life well lived, you should have some hearing loss because that means you've had lots of exposures, experiences. That's part of living. We don't want you to live in a bunker and not experience life either. So it is a balance. It's just kind of, being smart. If you're mowing the lawn, pop some, hearing protection on, things like that, which is typically pretty manageable. But there's no kind of set way to prevent hearing loss. And there's a lot of kind of, in my opinion, misinformation out there by some areas in the field that talk about when you have hearing loss, if you treat it, you're for sure not going to have any progression. And that's just not the case because you can't stop the damage once it's already been done. Like if you worked in a factory here in Colorado, we have Coors just down the road from me. And so a lot of my patients work at Coors. And so for them, yeah, if they're on the floor in the factory, that's pretty noisy. Even if you're doubling up with hearing protection, it's still a lifetime of noise exposure. And that does take a beating to those inner ear hair cells over time. So it's also knowing that there's no perfect way to prevent it, unfortunately. I wish I could give you a magic pill and say, yep, here's your vitamin supplement, but there's no FDA approved supplement or anything like that on the market that truly prevents hearing loss. It's one of those things where people come in, same thing for tinnitus, and they say, well, I saw this and it says it's tinnitus prevention and cure. A lot of those things are actually filed under food, so they can kind of put whatever they want on the label, and it's not really been through any type of clinical trial. There hasn't been any evidence that I've seen that really suggests any true prevention or reversal of tinnitus and things like that, or hearing loss. Yeah.
What's the best way to address it when it's mild? What are your suggestions when it's mild?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is you should probably try and get a baseline test every 5 to 10 years in your lifetime, because then you'll really know where is your hearing. You know, you check every other sense when you go to the doctor. Most primary cares don't do a hearing screening. They'll do an eye screening, things like that, but hearing really has fallen through the cracks. So that's my number one thing, is get a baseline if you haven't gotten one. And when it comes to mild hearing loss, you know, there's a couple of things right now in the industry. You know, some of them are called hidden hearing loss, which in my opinion can sometimes be synonymous with a mild hearing loss. But mild is almost a little bit misleading, because you know, there are individuals who maybe have had very sensitive hearing their whole life, high acuity, can hear really well, and so their hearing loss now trickles into kind of a near normal mild hearing loss range, where maybe they're still hearing about, you know, there's something called a speech intelligibility index score, before I get too technical, where basically it's a percentage of the speech sounds that an individual can detect at a normal volume. And so if typically when you're thinking about hearing aids, if that number is below 80%, that's typically when we say, okay, we need to start thinking about hearing aids, because then over a quarter of what's being said, your brain is having to fill in the gaps. That's a little bit more work than your prefrontal cortex needs to do. But with a mild hearing loss, sometimes people are hovering at that 83%, 80%, or maybe it's even better and it's in 90%, but they come in and they say, really struggling. I feel like I can't hear my kids. I feel like I'm turning up the TV volume. And so the term is a little bit misleading, because maybe that individual, like I said, had really sensitive hearing loss, and there may be a 20 dB drop over the past 3 years, which is a big drop in our field. So even though it's mild, doesn't mean that they're not going to notice benefits. I don't know, Bailey, do you want to talk a little bit about mild hearing loss and kind of what the OTC industry is designed for, and kind of some of the precautions with that?
Yes, yeah.
I was hoping you were going to talk about the OTC market.
I know, everybody asks, everybody wants to know.
Yes. And this is where, with one of those instances, like Carly was saying, hearing aids might not be what that person needs at that particular moment, but a lot of where these people will notice more of a struggle is in those noisy environments where they're trying to pick out and pick apart those signals, with speakers who may be mumbling or may have a higher pitched voice, which is where they see a lot of their losses. And this is where OTCs may actually have an appropriate impact on that individual. At the moment, over the counters, what OTCs are, over the counter hearing devices are made and approved by the FDA for mild to moderate hearing losses in individuals. So anything past that, we broach that speech intelligibility index past that 80% that Dr. Amoro was talking about, where over-the-counter hearing aids just are not cutting it. They need a higher and more advanced technology. But for those individuals with a mild hearing loss, I would debate moderate is maybe even a little bit of a stretch with that as well. But in that mild hearing loss, it provides just the amount of amplification that might help a person in some of those noisy environments. And one thing I think is important to mention, mild hearing loss, like Dr. Morrow was saying, is very subjective. It might not be mild for that individual. And even a mild hearing loss is impactful in your overall brain health as well. What we see when hearing losses begin in, any aged individual is our brains are incredibly resourceful. And so when parts of our brains are not functioning at kind of top tier as they should, it reallocates other parts of the brain to take that over. And so when we have a hearing loss, and the part of our brain that works to process a lot of these signals, if it's not working as well as it should, we actually see a lot of these visual modalities and visual parts of the brain begin to encroach on what would be processing our hearing signal. And when you think about it, kind of makes sense. We also notice that some proprioceptive signals, so like our body awareness and our awareness of space, takes over this part as well. Because when we think of sensory deprivation as a whole, when we have a hearing loss, what are we more focusing on? We're focusing on those visual cues, and especially with our balance system that's also housed in our inner ear. That's kind of where our body awareness and our awareness in space comes into play as well. So our brain begins to find other ways to fill these gaps. And we see that even in a mild hearing loss. So though it might not be very impactful in your day-to-day life, it is causing some of these cortical changes to take place, which does require some sort of an intervention. Thankfully, with shorter durations of untreated hearing loss, we see that this encroaching of other modalities in this part of the brain does reverse, which is nice. So we get a pair of hearing aids on an individual, we kind of shake or blow the dust off of that particular part of the brain a little bit more, then kind of lights back up and we don't see that as much. But all of this is to say is that even a mild hearing loss can be impactful in ways that we don't know. And so like Carly was saying, making sure you're going in every 3 years, monitoring the progression, knowing any sort of genetic impacts that could take place as well, and progress that hearing loss a little bit quicker is very important information.
I just had a quick comment, and maybe you can agree, well, maybe you agree with me or give me any other suggestions, but Pam and I work with a lot of folks with dementia. In Kelch communities, 80% of our communities are dementia care communities. So that's the majority of who I'm working with, caregivers. And oftentimes I come into play with folks that have just been maybe just recently diagnosed. We know it's been happening years before, but I am always recommending that if they are having some hearing loss, to go see an audiologist and have that hearing test, because what we find a big challenge is they need to be able to learn how to use the hearing aids. Because if it's too late and the dementia is too progressed, we find it very difficult as operators trying to care for them. And then it just makes it even worse for them to communicate and for their quality of life.
That's a great point. I mean, and I think you're spot on there. I don't remember if I may have said, it's been a long day, you guys. I may have said this earlier, but, with untreated hearing loss, some of the research out there right now is suggesting that if you have other kind of cardiovascular diseases or risks, that you are at a higher likelihood. Some numbers have said 48% more likely to progress the cognitive decline sooner than individuals who don't have cardiovascular. Now, when I was listening to Angel talk a little bit about kind of the blood flow from the heart and things like that, then I was like, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense, because then you're doubling down on two senses that are in, factors that are really important for blood flow to the brain. Because people ask me all the time, why does cardiovascular affect that? What does that have to do with anything? And before this talk, I was like, that's a wonderful question. And I'm sure they will explore it in further research. But, it kind of connected the dots there. I mean, the other piece of it, too, is, they showed that individuals who treated the hearing loss, like I said, were more likely to slow down that progression. We can't stop it. And part of it is, it's a select study. There's only so many people. So definitely there needs to be more research on that. But, when you're thinking about brain stimulation, having that neural network fully firing, also helping your working memory not have to do multiple things when it's already, at a disadvantage with what happens with Alzheimer's disease and dementia in the brain on a neural level. So, it makes sense that, we want to keep that brain firing. We want to stimulate it as much as we can. And so the easiest way, and it's actually I think it's like the #1 preventable risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and dementia, is hearing loss. And so, when you think of it from that perspective, what's more important, your long-term brain health or how I feel about wearing a hearing aid? Most people nowadays, their biggest concern when I see them when they have a mild hearing loss specifically is, I have a family history of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. I know I have this mild hearing loss. I'm a little bit concerned about my progression. I go, then we need to talk about a hearing aid.
Yep.
Now,
Can we talk about that a bit?
Yeah.
So one of
Sure.
the things, because we're getting close to the end of the hour, when I posted this on LinkedIn, a gentleman came back and said, well, the reason why nobody wants to wear hearing aids is because they're ugly and there's a stigma to them. And I said, they look differently depending on how much you're investing, but also everybody is wearing AirPods in their ears anyway. So can you talk a bit about what's out there today? Because I know these are not not your father's hearing aids anymore. There's a lot of progression in technology. Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm going to take the lead on this, Bailey, just because I have some in office and I don't think you have any there at your desk. But hearing aids can come in all shapes and sizes. Yes, when you think about old school hearing aids where they were bigger, they were, tan colored in the ear, they still make those. They're just updated. They're rechargeable, they're Bluetooth compatible, they are waterproof. So there's been some changes, so you don't have to worry about fiddling with those teeny tiny batteries. But they're also really discreet. A lot of people go, well, I don't want anything behind my ear. And honestly, I go, well, that's going to be the most discreet option. So let's work through why we feel that way. And a lot of times it's because they think, I just want the smallest in the ear size, which depending on your hearing loss and your ear anatomy, that might not be appropriate. But they're super discreet. I mean, yes, my hair is down. Yes, I have a lot of hair, but I'm wearing my hearing aids right now. I can't see the camera, so I'm just going to show you. And I'm actually in a demo set, so these ones don't even match my hair color.
Oh, wow.
Can't even see him hardly.
No.
Yeah, they're pretty small. These ones are silver. Oh, sorry, the blur is kind of taking it away.
Oh, you're good.
So that's one option, but there's so many. I mean, so these are kind of the ranges from.
Yep, I can see them.
Not focusing on my face.
No, you're good. You're good.
It's done. Anyway, so they come in all shapes and sizes. They're a lot smaller than they used to. Some of the manufacturers have more fun colors. So like my next set of hearing aids, I tell people around the 5-year mark is when you should be looking at new hearing aids. Mainly because if you think about a computer from 5 years ago, the technology is so much better nowadays, faster, more reliable, can do more, can carry more load. And so hearing aids are basically two very small computers. There are anywhere from 2 to 3 microphones, 1 to 3 microphones on each device, and they're constantly sending the information for the majority of hearing aids back and forth to automatically adapt to the situation you're in. And so, when you're thinking about how they work, what they look like, depending on your lifestyle, what's important for you and things like that, we can certainly get an option that's comfortable, discreet. Nowadays, some of the newer technology has really, really incredible AI technology in it, where it's actually trying to predict the speech that you're hearing in noise and tease that out over the background noise. So
wow, finally a good use for AI.
Yeah, no kidding. And so, they've really come a long way that I say, give it a shot. A lot of people go, I don't want hearing aids, it means I'm old. It doesn't mean you're old. I'm 30 years old. I've worn hearing aids for 25 years, basically.
Yeah.
Hearing loss does not discriminate.
No, and it doesn't define you. So
no, it doesn't.
Exactly.
No.
Get over yourself. Because that's the other thing, right? It's ego. So we had 2 more questions. One is, and my dad had this problem, ear wax, and it being impacted in the ear. And I'm sure You know, Paige, you run into this with your residents because everybody's older. What can we do aside, because the drops don't work, bottom line, when you're in this situation? What do you recommend? And then we have one more question.
So I'll say with the drops, the issue is people don't use them enough. You really need to use them for like 4 to 5 days in a row and flush every morning. So I tell people to put them in at night for 4 to 5 nights. Every morning you flush it out. Now, that being said, some people are very waxy. Wax is a protective mechanism for our ears to help keep foreign bodies from getting in there. Some people have very hairy ears as they get older, and the wax gets stuck in the hair. And so, yes, the Debrox drops and flushing isn't going to be enough. And so really, the best thing you can do is go to your local ENT clinic or see if there's a nurse practitioner who'd be willing to flush the ears. The only thing is I would say use the drops before the flushing. Like do the 5 nights before you're getting it flushed. It's going to be more comfortable that way. Also, the biggest thing is if you are flushing them, I mean, in the shower, you can let water run in your ear every day when you're doing that. But really, it's just having it professionally removed is probably the best way to do it. If you're doing water, be aware that if you make it too hot or too cold, it can cause a dizziness or a temporary vertigo where the room feels like it's spinning because you stimulate the vestibular or balance system in the ear. That's normal. It's okay. Don't keep flushing your ear at that temperature. Please change it. I don't want you to throw up.
Well, and we don't want you lighting a candle either, right? That whole.
Please do not.
Oh my gosh, I could not believe when I heard that one. That was like, oh my gosh, please don't do that. Okay, well, so because we're right at almost the top of the hour, I want to make sure that Angel has a chance to weigh in on this, but also you both. The question is, if you have a loved one or you do have hearing loss, how do you get diagnosed for dementia? Because those are audible tests.
Yeah, so there are actually a couple other resources, and there's now other cognitive tests that can be done that are computer-based. So they require some basic instructions in the beginning. You know, if communication is an implication and a factor in there, where very basic instructions, and then the computer prompts the individual to do some of those tests following that. And Carly and I also have had some great resources in terms of speech to text apps that are free. I use those daily at work with my individuals who have a more profound hearing loss. In addition to written instructions, there's also making sure you're keeping your hands away from your mouth. You're speaking slowly and enunciating. Many of these individuals have been down this road so many times, and they are very, very good at lip reading, but that does require being able to see your mouth. Don't have to yell at them. They're mostly using those visual cues anyway, but making sure that they can see you. But technology has advanced quite a bit in terms of some of those text instructions that just prompt the person to complete some of those cognitive tests on their own.
Angel, did you have any thoughts on that?
You know, not really, other than that, if a person might have, you know, if they're perhaps having advanced dementia, then that might not work, but then you may be going to see you know, a neuropsychologist or someone like that to have further testing.
And odds are they're probably been diagnosed by that stage, you know, mid to late stage, they're probably been diagnosed. So yeah, that's,
well,
go ahead.
And Angel makes a great point. A lot of these cognitive tests are to diagnose some sort of a cognitive impairment. They are not to diagnose dementia. You would have to go to a neurophysician, a neuropsychologist, or somebody like that to receive an actual diagnosis.
Yeah, yeah. And Dr. Amaro, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think Bailey really covered it there. That's pretty much all of the recommendation that I would make. I mean, the hardest part, because I see patients for a hearing test where their neurologist wants to see what we can do, because they can't tell what is it as far as the dementia Alzheimer's disease and versus what is it them not hearing you. And so from our side, when people have later stages of dementia, it can be very hard to test them, where we almost have to kind of treat them like we do our pediatric testing, just to make it more fun, engaging, and be able to get some of those thresholds and levels. So it can be done. It definitely is challenging. And, as many people who, have family members or work with individuals with dementia and Alzheimer's disease, going to doctor's appointments in the later stages can be very draining on the individual. And so we do keep that in mind. Well, I do. I can't speak for everyone. I keep that in mind when I'm doing the testing. But I would also say that sometimes people don't tell me until the end of the appointment that they maybe have some of the early diagnosis or something like that. If you're going with a loved one, I encourage you to tell that provider right away, because it's going to change, how much I really take in the information they're saying. Like if it looks like you and your family member are combating on a response, in the healthcare field, I tend to want to listen to the patient because it's coming from their mouth. But if I know that their memory may not be the best, or they're typically confusing things and stuff like that, I'm able to not have to go, oh, okay, I don't know who to believe. I can say, okay, I can acknowledge the patient, take that information, and then, maybe circle back with the loved one and say, okay, I saw that maybe you didn't quite agree with that. Or I'll just say, oh, it looks like, you're nodding your head. Tell me what you noticed about their hearing. When the person says, I don't have any issue hearing. So it's helpful for us to really make sure we're getting an accurate case history and also accurate amount of information about what's going on with the individual.
Or even how to interact with them. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir. I lived this. So it's wonderful to see a different way of handling those who are struggling with cognitive impairment. So
yep, absolutely. Well, thank you, ladies, Angel, Dr. Harmon, and Dr. Amuro. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your feedback and your expertise and knowledge. Pam, thank you. And everybody, our next webinar will not be on the fourth Thursday because that's Thanksgiving. That's the holiday. So
21st, November 21st.
November 21st. So we will get that out to everybody. And Pam, anything else?
Actually, no. Thank you again to our prestigious guests. This has been amazing. We do plan on sending out the recording to everybody who's registered. So you should be able to share that with your family members, your friends, your peers, because this is so important between sugar and hearing loss. If we really want to reduce the amount of dementia in our generations moving forward, we really need to build more awareness about these two topics, because I don't hear it enough, pardon the pun. But I really don't. From my dementia caregivers, I don't hear it that much. I hear more about, he doesn't want to wear his hearing aids, or the caregivers aren't putting the hearing aids in the charger, or those kinds of things. And it's like, well, what if we turn the clock back? So thank you. You've spoken to my heart. So thank you for your expertise. Okay. Thank you so much.
Have a good evening, everybody.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you again.